Now to more from Michael Shellenberger, the long-time environmental campaigner and climate change activist, once named a hero of the environment by Time magazine. I spoke to him last night about his new book, Apocalypse Never, Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All. He joined me via Skype from California. And in the second half of the interview, I asked him about the facts he claims that few people seem to know, such as the fact that climate change is not making natural disasters worse.
This is very important. So I think this is when people think of climate change, they think of the Australian fires last year, flooding, heat waves that kill people, droughts. So I think the most important thing, I mean, if I had two things that people would take away from this book, it would just be that deaths from natural disasters have declined 90% over the last century, during which time population quadrupled, and deaths from natural disasters declined 80% over the last 40 years, including in poor countries, which is just, we should celebrate this, right? No one has heard of this, but this is amazing news. We're getting better at protecting ourselves from horrible events. It's great. The second thing is that carbon emissions have been declining in most rich countries for decades. They've been declining in Britain and France and Germany for since the mid-70s. And that's the same thing that's going to happen in poor countries. They're going to move from coal to natural gas and then to nuclear, and emissions are going to go down. So this is not, things are not going in the wrong direction. They're actually going in the right direction on these two key measures of climate adaptation and climate mitigation. Now, people will say, isn't there some role that global heating has played in extending the fire season in California and Australia? Yes, there is evidence of that. However, it is massively outweighed by two factors: the accumulation of wood fuel in the forests and the development of new houses near forests. And so is there some contributing role of climate change? Yes. Is it very significant? No. And when you have these debates over whether or not you can detect it, that's just evidence that it's not very significant.
Yeah,
and that's basically the same on all of these disasters.
Yeah, look, there's a lot to unpack there. I'll try and get through some of it. For instance, let's start with the fires. I've been involved in this debate in Australia. We've always had catastrophic fires in our climate and our environment. We always will. I've recognised in writing that climate change can have an influence in that. There's some evidence. But for instance, going back to what you were saying earlier about the scientific pressure or the pressure on scientists, we had our leading expert on drought in this country say there's no link at this stage, no proven link between climate change and the drought that preceded our latest bushfires. And suddenly he was forced to effectively qualify his own statement then and make sure that nobody thought he was questioning the role of climate change. He had to qualify his own factual findings because of the pressure in the debate.
There's a lot of that, and I tell one story. You know, there's so many stories you can tell, and what I wanted to do for the book is to have a set of characters that run through the whole book. And so I have one scientist who I think is the most important scientist who studies trends in natural disasters. His name is Roger Pelkey, and he's a beautiful person in general, a very good person, very good scientist. And he was absolutely pilloried, smeared. There was an orchestrated campaign against him from the White House, which I document in my book. It's not for the first time, but I go into some depth into it. And it's quite unconscionable. It's McCarthyite tactics that they used against him, and it worked. He happily had tenure. He was able to keep his job, but lost a lot of funding and lost a lot of, opportunities to publish and to speak, and it was quite horrible. And so I was very happy to tell that story. I've been collecting other stories like that, including, frankly, defamatory information spread about one of the scientists who talks about the polar bear science. I quibble with some of the things she says, but basically she gets it almost right. And yeah, we hear these stories all the time where scientists are forced to somehow retract factual statements. And obviously we've seen this kind of will to censor and to cancel in other parts of the culture. And I think a lot of it actually began in the climate debates.
After this interview, Michael, I'll send you some material about an Australian professor who lost his job for disputing some of the science around the Great Barrier Reef. But just going on from what you said earlier as well about richer nations reducing their carbon dioxide emissions, their greenhouse gas emissions over recent decades, Australia is, of course, one of those nations as well. We've started to reduce our emissions. Should countries like Australia and those European nations you mentioned be doing more? Because that's what the campaigners are saying. Those rich countries should be reducing their emissions by greater amounts. Do you believe that that's the case?
Well, here's what I think is important, is that everybody understands the simplest mechanism, which is that we want to move from energy dilute fuels to energy dense fuels. That's the same thing as saying we should move from carbon intensive fuels to hydrogen intensive fuels. That's all that matters when it comes to protecting the natural environment and reducing air pollution significantly, are those things. Now you can move to cleaner burning coal plants. I'm not going to say that doesn't matter. In my book, I talk about how it does matter. But those energy transitions, and they go from wood to coal to petroleum to natural gas to uranium, that's very positive. So I think everybody should try to move a little bit quicker along that line. If you care about the natural environment, you're obviously balancing that with economic needs. What's really being said by those people in Australia is the same I said here, which is they're saying you should do more renewables. And they're, in fact, when you say, well, what about doing more nuclear? They say, oh, heavens, no, we can't do more nuclear. And I make a lot of that in the book. In fact, this book is, in many ways, has nuclear at the heart of it. I was obsessed with this question of why, if you think climate change is the end of the world, are you against all of the most important solutions to it, which is basically moving from coal to natural gas, which is what Australia is doing, or moving from coal and natural gas to nuclear.
Well, it's one of the few issues.
What so many other countries are doing.
If you talk about reducing greenhouse gas emissions as being the prime aim, then surely it's one of the few problems where there is actually a silver bullet, that is nuclear energy.
Of course, and not only that, but everybody knows it, and we've been talking about it for years. I mean, I remember as an anti-nuclear progressive or lefty, hearing about France and being like, well, that's weird, because I thought that nuclear was right-wing, but sounds like France is pretty socialistic. I mean, they've socialized medicine and they have socialized energy, and they're very left-wing people. They protest everything all the time.
Yes.
And I remember being like, well, maybe nuclear is not this left-right thing. Maybe nuclear is just better. And so what I wanted to get to the bottom of is, who are the people that are so threatened by nuclear? What is it that they're threatened by? And what it is that they're threatened by is that if you have nuclear, then we're never going to run out of anything. You have infinite energy, infinite water, infinite fertilizer, infinite food. There is no energy scarcity with nuclear. It's functionally infinite. So if you're somebody that wants to take control of big sectors of the economy by being alarmist about climate change, nuclear is a problem for you. And you have to find some way to demonize nuclear, which is what they've done. And it's very easy to do it because you just make people think about nuclear weapons. That's all they do.
Finally, Michael, I wonder if you can sum up in your book, are you optimistic that the climate change debate can become more rational, more logical, and look for more practical outcomes like nuclear energy? And also, along the way, can we find the time in the environmental debate to focus on the other issues like preserving species by preserving their habitat, or stopping river pollution and those other environmental issues that seem to have been put on the back burner by so many people?
Well, yeah, I mean, I mentioned that I testified in front of Congress, and I was expecting the Republicans to start talking about sunspots, or about how the world's not really warming, or about how carbon dioxide is not really a molecule that warms the atmosphere, and nobody said that. I think that's pretty marginal stuff, honestly, and I think that most Republicans want to move away from that, are moving away from that, and do care about wildlife. I mean, the people that are fighting these horrible industrial wind turbines in the United States and Europe and Australia tend to be more right of center. They tend to be people who love hawks and eagles and owls and bats and all the wildlife that are being killed by industrial wind turbines. So I do think there's a possibility of more of a center-right environmental movement that understands that climate change is not the most important environmental issue, that the most important environmental issues are other than those that do include questions of wildlife and habitat. And that also by having a more moderate position on climate change, I think it'll be harder for the radical left to demonize people on the right as deniers.
Michael, good luck with the book. It's called Apocalypse Never: Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Fascinating stuff. And Kevin Rudd, I hope you learned something in that second half.